Battles magazine is easily the best wargame magazine that you have out there these days. No offense for the magazines, but each issue of Battles is just a treasure chest filled with reviews and essays about serious or families of war games, articles about war game design, and all the articles are just of such good quality. You can really tell that the authors took the time to familiarize themselves with the topic. There are fantastic images. It's just a magazine that is so fun and pleasant to read that sometimes I almost forget to play the game that comes with the magazine, which is really why it took me so long to play the game that I'm reviewing today, that came with Battles issue number 4, that's like from a year ago. The game is called Race for Berlin. It is a two-player game set in the last days of World War II. The players take the role of the leaders of two sections of the Soviet army that is advancing and giving the final push against the German army in order to take control of Berlin. However, there are a couple of twists here. The first twist is that the players also maneuver part of the German army that is going to oppose the advance of the Soviet army. Another twist is that here you're not really trying to win the war, but you're really trying to win the race. That is, each player is trying to perform actions in such a way that will win him Stalin's admiration. Victory points are awarded not just for the areas that you manage to control, but also for performing certain actions during the game in such a way that, again, you will look good in the media, you will look good by the standards of Soviet propaganda. Stalin will love you and will just prefer you over the other commander. So this is another interesting twist, this mediatic propagandistic aspect. So this is the premise of the game. Let's take a look at the game itself. These are all the components for the game. Here you have a player aid with most of the information that you need to play the game, terrain, 2 combat tables, modifiers. However, there's still quite a bit of information that you will want to have handy as you're playing the game. It would have been useful to have that information gathered in one place in a player aid. So either you make your own player aid, or there is a very good one available on the Geek. I suggest you download that one. Here you have the rulebook, which is 16 pages long, but these are very small pages. The rulebook is not long, but I didn't find it the clearest or the easiest rulebook to understand. Sometimes the phrasing seemed a little vague to me. Sometimes the information wasn't where I would expect it to be. And again, this information is scattered in here that it would be good to have all in one place. You have event sheets that you will place in a cup. Cup doesn't come with a game. You have to provide your own markers, reinforcements, and then you have the map. And the map is a beauty. It is really pretty. Here you also have the initial setup with the Soviet side belonging to the Zhukov player that is ready to advance against Berlin, and with the German side of the Konev player that is ready to stop them. And symmetrically enough, here you have the Soviet side of the Konev player trying to advance again with the German side of the Zhukov player. Here you have several tracks. Actually, this guy shouldn't be there at the beginning. You have several tracks that are used by the Americans to advance against Berlin. So each turn the players will roll a die to see if a new American unit is added on a track, on that track, but there are also other tracks that the Americans can use. And they're just advancing and trying to steal your glory and get to Berlin before you get there. So you really have to try to beat them to Berlin and get there before they do. Here you have Berlin. Also you have around Berlin areas with the red star that represents the areas that will allow the players to score victory points. Each turn starts with a quite elaborate series of steps. First, the players roll to see if they receive reinforcements for that turn. Then the players roll to see what the Americans do, if they're able to add a unit to one of their tracks, if they advance, or if nothing happens. Then the players roll to see if one of them receives an order from Hitler to counterattack the Soviets with his German side. Then the players draw an event sheet that can be played later in the game. Then the players check if all of their units are in supply, or the supply units suffer penalties, of course. Then each player receives a replacement point, and replacement points can be spent to flip a reduced unit to its full side, or to bring back into the game a unit that was eliminated earlier. After all those administrative steps, then you finally have the operation phase. At the beginning of the operation phase, the players will play the operation marker on the box number 1 of the turn track, or the operation track if they have one, they made one, they downloaded one. Each operation phase is divided in 4 impulses. And first, the Soviet side of the Zhukov player will activate. That's the first impulse. Then the Soviet side of the Konev player activates. Then the German side of the Konev player, and then the Soviet side of the Zhukov player. So these are the 4 impulses. During each impulse, the owning player is allowed to activate up to 4 units belonging to that group. So up to 4 units here, up to 4 units here, 4 units, and 4 units. Once those units have been activated, the players go back to the operation track and they roll a die. If they roll the same number or less than the operation marker is on, then the turn is over, they move on to the next turn. Otherwise, they move the operation marker by 1 box, and they have another operation phase. So again, they have the 4 impulses, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 units, 4 units, 4 units, 4 units, and then they just go back here, roll again, and they repeat until they roll the number that the operation marker is on or less. So a turn will have anywhere between 1 and 6 operation phases. That means that the number of units that the players can activate and count on will vary vastly from turn to turn. Units can be activated for movement or for combat, or can be placed in reserve, only one of these. Units in reserve will move after combat at the end of the impulse. Units activated for movement will move at the beginning of the impulse. Units activated for movement can move by a number of areas up to the movement allowance printed at the bottom of their counter. However, that number can be modified based on terrain and on being out of supply. And movement presents special restrictions and challenges for both the Soviets and the Germans. A major restriction for Soviet units is stacking limits. Once Soviet units move past this line, they have a stacking limit of 2 units per area, which is really limiting. Also, Soviet units are divided by armies, and each army is formed by 2 units, as you can see from the matching stripes there. And the player activating Soviet units has to keep the units forming an army as close as possible to one another for as long as possible. So there you have another restriction. The German units also have stacking limits, but their main restriction is represented by the numerical indexes that you see in the different areas of the board. In fact, these numerical indexes go down, become lower as you move west, and at the beginning of the game, the German units are not allowed to move freely into areas with numerical indexes lower than the area in which they are. So basically, Hitler is forbidding them from retreating, from moving west, and if a unit is trying to do that, it has to roll a die, and it may or may not be allowed to retreat. Most likely not. Later in the game, the German units get better chances of retreating freely, but at the beginning it is really hard. Units can be activated for combat, and combat outside of Berlin is resolved by using this table. First, you calculate the combat odds by dividing the total combat factors of the attacker by the total combat factors of the defender. However, there are important modifiers. The combat factors of the defenders are doubled if the defenders are in a zone with difficult terrain, that means rough terrain, and the attack power of the attackers are halved if the attackers are attacking across a river. At the beginning of the game, all Soviet units will attack from across a river, so these 2 modifiers, especially when they're combined, will affect the power of the Soviet units to advance greatly, especially at the beginning of the game. When you have modifiers applied to the die roll, then you find the right column, you roll, modify, cross-reference, and you will find the result that may be that the attacker loses some steps, the defender loses some steps. An R would indicate that the defender retreats. And I must say, I'm not a big fan of this combat table. It looks a little too vague and generic to me. And then you don't have any ratio above 4 to 1. And there are many cases in which the Soviet units are able to mount an attack which goes all the way up to 6 to 1 or 7 to 1. And all that firepower, all that combat capability is completely lost, because everything that is above 4 to 1 is completely lost. I don't have time to cover this in detail, but I want to acknowledge the fact that units in Berlin follow a completely different set of rules from units outside of Berlin. In Berlin, movement works differently, combat is different. Combat has to take into account also the intrinsic garrisons that you see printed on the map. Combat in Berlin is resolved using a different combat table that not only does tell you if the attacker and or the defender are losing steps, but also if there are variations in the level of control that the Soviets have of a certain area of Berlin, and you will keep track of the control going up or down using these markers here. The game will continue at least until the end of turn 7. At that point, if there is a Soviet unit in each area of Berlin, the players will roll a die, will modify that based on the level of control that they have in Berlin, and depending on the result, the game may be over at that point or may continue until next turn. At that point, they will have to test for the end of game at the end of each turn, and the game may continue all the way up to turn 10. At the end of turn 10, the game will be over automatically. Whenever the game is over, the players will determine the winner based on victory points. And victory points are awarded for control of certain areas on the map, but also for having performed certain actions during the game, actions that are not necessarily of military significance, but that looked good in the media, and that means they look good in the eyes of Stalin. Because remember, here you're trying to win the race, not necessarily to win the war. May sound a little shallow, and it kind of is, but I guess that each war has several aspects that are shallower than others, and this game is about one of those. As much as this game is built on interesting premises and definitely has a couple of smart concepts in it, somehow I could not fall in love with it. Somehow I did not warm up to it. It has interesting ideas here and there, all these elements of Chrome that add not only historical feel, but more variability. You have a variable number of operational phases, you have a variable arrival of reinforcements, the event chits that may or may not trigger certain other specific events. All that, again, seems to add a lot of variability and predictability, but to me it could not make up for or hide or, again, whatever, the fact that at the core this game felt to me like a fairly repetitive and static game of attrition. The German units are trying to slow down the Soviet advance, and they'll do that by getting in the way of the Soviets. Occasionally they will try to cut a supply line, but most of the time they'll be there trying to take a bullet and to divide the bullets that they take in such a way they can still put together a front for as long as possible. And the combat tables and the terrain and other mechanisms of the game really facilitate that, really make it in such a way that the Soviet sides will advance at a sluggish, agonizing pace, because the pace is a little slow. You just had the impression that you're not going anywhere. And I had this impression I was underwhelmed by this attritional process. So I contacted Wargamer Extraordinaire Piero Piero, who also wrote an excellent report about this game on The Geek, because I wanted to know if I was just seeing things, if it was just me. And he had a very similar experience, and actually I'm going to quote him because I really like the images, the ideas that he shared with me, that this game, yes, is based on attrition, which is not necessarily a bad thing. In Paths of Glory, you have a lot of attrition, but it's an attrition that creates tension, because you always had the impression that a front may finally collapse because of attrition, and that would turn the tables and create all sort of events. So that creates tension. In this game, you don't have that sense. You really have the sense it's going to be attrition that is going to slow down the Soviets a little bit more or a little bit less. And again, I completely agree with all of these things. I just felt a little constricted by the system. So again, not my favorite game that I played recently. Definitely, the magazine is still good. You should definitely get the magazine and read it because it's fantastic. Anyways, this is all for today for this game. Next, I'm going to review Montebello, a print and play game about the Italian Wars of Independence. So stay tuned, don't go anywhere, but in the meanwhile, keep playing.